All right, here we go. So for the third video that I'm making, I want to actually explain my process in working to solve the negative zero-sum problem and the pleasurable exclusive access problem. Now, I've come at this a lot of different ways, and a lot of those ways failed miserably. My breakthrough was when I figured out that each individual has an individual heaven. And you can't put two people in the same reality, actual people, and have it work forever. It just doesn't, it's not possible. I mean, we're all so unique that over time we'll eventually diverge and want to experience something else, and then we'll experience something else with someone else, and we'll want to experience something else. And so what you need, my big breakthrough in that was that in order to make this work, you need to have everybody who exists in their own reality. And my proto experiments with this were disastrous. Absolutely disastrous. My proto experiments with this. I mean, it was like hell for everybody. It was awful. And when I got to a point where I started looking at, so basically we have two things we have to look at here. Once I started getting to this point, now we have two plans, and I only see two plans at this point. I can't fathom. My mind crunches variables like crazy, you know. And so what I realized is we either have what's that called? Surprisingly enough, I have a lot of brain damage. I'm just going to put that out there. So every once in a while I get brain fog, which is not unusual for anybody, even if they don't have brain damage. But the first problem is, or the first solution that I worked on that started seeming viable was a hyperdimensional mirror reality. Hyperdimensional meaning it processes all the infinite dimensions simultaneously, so that, like, when you look at a mirror and you touch the mirror, I'm going to touch the screen for, I have to touch the camera, sorry. When you look at a mirror, you touch the mirror and the person behind the mirror doesn't feel a damn thing, but they're acting just like you. If you use a concave mirror, it'll actually look like the way people see you. I mean, the image is reversed, obviously, in a normal mirror. But and then you can toggle the being off the other side of the mirror to see the environment. And these are the kinds of things I was looking at, because I realized the only way we can pull this off is if we get everything we want at nobody else's expense. But it's hard to do that. Actually, it's impossible when you look over the course of infinity. And so eventually somebody's consent's going to be violated, and potentially violated in a major way. And so you have to look at a situation where every being is not a sentient being. You have to look at that situation. And this is true for each individual. It's even true for a microbe. It's true for, a cat. You have to actually solve this problem. And the hyperdimensional mirror thing is kind of risky, because if you screw up on the hyperdimensional mirror realities, it's hypothetically possible that somebody may get lost in the shuffle. And once you're locked into that reality, you can't get back out of it. And I started looking at this. I'm like, this is a beautiful solution. Obviously, a grand creator who is omnibenevolent would have just made this happen, but it's not the case. And so I'm like, okay, that's a very high risk, high reward scenario. And the high risk scenario is that you're sent to hell forever and nobody can pull you out of it. And that may actually happen to every single being who does this. I'm like, okay, all right. So I start looking at it. And I understood a different solution, which is, okay, let's say we have an omnibenevolent being who can do effectively what we would. Have you ever had a dream? Let me back up a little bit. Have you ever had a dream where you wake up and you realize that your body wasn't there, but you could just scroll around with your sight, different positions of the situation, almost as if like you were watching a Hollywood movie with a camera, and it moves around in a way that you realize that's, yeah, I mean, it's a camera, it's embodied, but when you look at the video, it's almost like the dream. But in the dream, you realize you don't have a body. You're literally just disembodied, looking at the situation from multiple perspectives. And so I took that concept and I worked with it a little bit, and I started to realize on multiple levels that, I mean, the other solution is that there's technically a higher being, and this, I'm going to take a deep sigh. Okay. So people who are religious think that there's only one supreme. All right? That's what they think. And nobody else, even if somebody else became that supreme, they would be exactly like it, thus they would cease to exist. Because there's no other difference in the highest level, and there's no other top above that supreme being. So once you meld your mind with that supreme being, you cease to exist, but the supreme being continues to exist. And I guess if everybody did that, then obviously the supreme being would also cease to exist, because you need otherness in order to exist. But that's not really the point. The point is, we have all the architecture already there for a being to, okay, so I'm combining two things here with the second solution. There are realities called marionette realities. And a marionette reality would be that you're basically puppeting a philosophic zombie, which is a different solution, which is a being that acts exactly the same as a being, but it has no sentience. And a marionette reality is that you have control over that without the problem of knowing everything that's going to happen before it happens. So to some extent, it just exudes from your will instead of planning the whole thing at once, and then now you get bored because everything happens exactly the way you made it. I mean, you could technically do a memory erasure and make it more entertaining, but these are the kinds of things you have to look at when you're looking at restructuring all of existence and giving every single being who's ever existed the best outcome. And so what you do with this kind of situation is let's say there's a hypothetical being. That's funny. Let's say there's a hypothetical being that can do all this stuff. And this hypothetical being was never born and will never die, and we were all created by it, and that kind of thing. Okay, sure, whatever. Fine, be that way. But let's say there's this hypothetical being. People call this being good, and they say it has all power and all knowledge and all. I don't even want to get into all that stuff. But I will say, because they define it as good, it has a term called omnibenevolence, meaning it's all good. And so you can test this idea. And so if a being made all of us and it loves us all for who we are and this and that, and it made us to have some sense of will, like it does, but ultimately at the end of the day, it understands everything we are and everything that's going to happen, and it still loves us for it indefinitely. Okay, whatever. Yeah. So, but what this omnibenevolent being can do and it has this power, is, let's say because everybody has a different heaven. There's no two people who have the same heaven. It's not like there's heaven and everybody goes there and they're happy. Existence doesn't work that way. I'm really sorry to break that to you. It doesn't work that way. So this being can actually marionette every being in your reality, and each being has a different reality. So you have a being that's processing an infinite number of realities, and it's marionetting every being in your reality to your desire. So with this kind of situation, what it does with its kind of disembodied intelligence, spirit, is for every marionetted being, and this is actually a really hard problem to solve in hyperdimensional mirror realities, but this can be solved with an omnibenevolent being who hypothetically is our creator. This technically can be solved. It can kind of be solved with hyperdimensional mirror realities, but man, it's a tough problem. And this is a much easier problem to solve in this way. But, excuse me. This being can be puppeting every being in existence, except for the being that's actually living their lives in their own reality. And the way it puppets it, marionettes it, is that using that kind of disembodied stuff, it can put its sight right in front of the other being's eyes. Not in its eyes. It's not actually occupying its body. This being's just a puppet. But in a disembodied way, it can actually put its sight right in front of its eyes, so that when you look at something and you say, hey, what do you think of this rose? So this being can effectively simulate with that other being and their spiritual what's that word? Signature. Their spiritual signature, their consciousness signature, their individual one. So it can play all these individual consciousness signatures at the same time. And this being would actually be able to look at the rose, even though the marionetted being is not a sentient being. And then it would effectively marionettation, whatever that. It would effectively just kind of move it like a puppet and say, oh yeah, that's a really pretty rose based on its spiritual and consciousness signatures. And, and they have signatures for smelling things and stuff like that. So the thing that's interesting about this is when you have to think about how to restructure existence so that nobody's consent's violated anymore, you can't just think about yourself. You have to actually think about the being that might be in the process of doing it. And that's a really, people are so egotistical, they just say, well, just make it happen, in a sense that they don't care about how much the being suffers is on the other side. Meaning that, this hypothetical super creator being might actually have feelings itself, and you have to consider that. Excuse me, when you're trying to make these kinds of things. And so you can't just just make it happen, because that might end up being a really bad being, or a really bad deal for the being who's in charge of all this. And it's definitely a bad being for everybody if we put somebody in charge of all this and they're not even good people, or a good being. That's not going to work at all. I mean, that's worst case scenario. There's a lot of worst case scenarios in existence. That's one of them. So you need to make sure that the being's good, and you need to make sure that it can't get hurt while it's helping you. You need to make sure of that. And this can be done by marionetting every being in existence and for your pleasure, without it having the capacity to be those beings and be hurt by being with you. Now, in this kind of world, I have to admit, where there's multiple beings in one world, I have to admit, I'm kind of, sometimes I say things and people get like, oh my God, I can't handle that information. Or, they just get in denial mode and all this. But in this world, I'm a decently, in general, somewhat congenial. But when you're working with the idea that somebody who almost nobody on planet Earth wants to hang out with, and this being has to give them everything they want, you have to look at the situation and say, okay, we need to figure out how to make it so that this person that almost nobody wants to hang out with is not hurting the being that's giving us everything we want. And so when you look at that problem very seriously, it's a pretty extensive problem. And the way you do that is you basically marionette people, and you run simulations on the marionette consciousness and spiritual signatures, and you realize that the being's not actually being hurt, it's just kind of giving you everything you want without actually having to deal with all the crap that a person brings to the table. And so it's just kind of like, yeah. So these are the kinds of things that are pondered. And at that point, let me see if there's anything else. No, I think that's it. I'm going to stop this.